I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. Transmission siting process now. This is going to be a kind of a rudimentary kind of where we're at on the ground now, and I'm going to wrap up where I think we need to go. So for Tom Sloan from Kansas, there's not going to be anything earth-shattering in my presentation. Bye, Tom. But it should give you a good overview to lay the foundation for our Q&A session, is my hope. First of all, I want to kind of contrast the intra or in-state versus interstate siting processes and where we're at today. The reality is that our entire world has changed in the last 10 years. Things like climate change policy, renewable portfolio standards, smart grid efforts, states try to capture the economic growth in what they call the clean or the smart grid sectors. We've been past, states have far outpassed in statutory law changes in those areas, far outpaced any changes in the permitting process for building transmission to actually hook the different resources that make those policy changes reality. And I think it's one of the huge flaws that we've faced in our policy making over the last decade is state legislatures, for the most part, not recognizing the planning and construction timelines it takes for infrastructure in the energy sector and not matching up policy changes with the actual time it takes to build something on the ground. And whether that's just, we're going to focus solely on the permitting process and building transmission here, but that also can apply to, besides electricity, pipeline, natural gas pipeline construction, and a whole host of other type of permitting activities. You know, for the most part, the modern grid, with a few exceptions like Hawaii and Alaska's actually has some projects to hook up southeast Alaska to both British Columbia and to the Washington and California with some of their renewable resources they want to bring online, will not be state jurisdictional kind of centric. So the grid is not going to neatly work within the boundaries of these lines that we arbitrarily drew back when we joined the Union. The infrastructure is going to flow along what we consider to be economic watersheds. So if you think about how the economic patterns of cash flow through your area, that tends to how that infrastructure flows will follow those economic activities as well. This is our current, you know, what we kind of consider to be our transmission and distribution system. I didn't actually draw this slide. I'm trying to give credit to people who I ripped them off from in the bottom right-hand corner, if you're curious. But you know, we've had this kind of neat transmission system with central generation assets here that go to a substation and get built out to the distribution system. The future transmission system is going to be much more holistic, and it's going to be a mosaic of both generation and different technologies on the generation side, both energy storage and what they call FACTS, which is a flexible kind of a SCADA system to make the grid flow better and be more efficient in its operation, and then going out to generation assets on the distribution side. And again, these technologies are not respective of state boundaries. They're going to be across the region. There's going to be more and more niche applications for both on the generation and the demand response side. I'm going to be a little bit West-centric in my remarks. I apologize for people from back in the eastern coast or in the Midwest, but that's where most of my experience lies. You know, again, this is an example. I put this slide up here. This is the example of what Western states have adopted as far as RPS standards go over the last several years as goals. None of these were coordinated with each other. They were all arbitrarily numbers that were drawn up by each state. There was no regional assessment about whether the transmission or the actual renewable resources in the West were there to meet this combined standard when you roll them all up to be a regional number. They're all done in a silo within these state jurisdictions, and that's the type of mistake I'm talking about a lack of a regional planning and coordination that we need today with this modern grid. This is a state-by-state siting authority paper here, and this will be available on the website after this presentation. But this gives you a good overview of the different state siting authorities that currently are in the 50 states. And there's really two models, the predominant one being this kind of lavender-type color, I'm going to guess that is. But that's where a state utility commission usually has some sort of condemnation authority to site infrastructure for incumbent utilities. States in yellow like Washington, Oregon, and Arizona actually have an independent siting commission that sites these lines separate from a utility commission, a public utility commission. And then there's some other examples of they have either no siting authority or a limited siting authority. And really what you should draw from this is that large infrastructure projects, transmission lines that are trying to match these resources. We've heard some good examples about just what the potential resources are in Mexico and Canada. Just here today, have to cross several of these jurisdictions to get to actually where load's at. And as you can see, it's just a morass of different siting processes and authorities. Because Congress recognized that there was really an unrealistic pathway to actually site regional transmission, especially high voltage transmission, they tried to give the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, backstop authority back in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. FERC tried to lay what they call national interest corridors down on the ground, and they were immediately challenged by states, and the states had, made those legal challenges, and that status is, I would say, in legal question right now. But basically, just to kind of recap simplistically what the authority was, is that if a state couldn't cite a proposed transmission line basically within 12 months, the federal government or FERC had the right to come into that state and cite that transmission within that state. Basically, I think the other thing that really complicates things from a state legislative perspective is that there's really what I call a spaghetti approach to planning, and it gets very confusing for lay citizen legislators to kind of track what are real projects going forward that have been announced and are being planned for as far as transmission goes, and what are just press releases coming out about proposed projects. And then when there's actually competing groups planning and that overlap their planning territory, it also adds confusion to what projects are real versus which ones are not. This is, again, just a map in the West of all the different groups that have a fingerprint or cook in the kitchen, so to speak, of making what I call the spaghetti of the West. And you can see many of these different groups have overlapping jurisdictions. There's not a clear predominant. Now, all these are within the WEC, which is the Western Energy Coordinating Council. But again, all these are supposed to bubble up to that kind of regional group and then have some sort of clarity comes. But there's a real disconnect between the WEC and actual state legislators and actually most utilities. One of the things that I do is whenever I have some of the CEOs from the major utilities in the West and I get the chance, I ask them who on your staff at your utility is actually representing you at the WEC, and not one has been able to tell me who that person is. And so the only reason is not to trash the WEC in that statement, but the reality is that if that group is having an impact on the operations of a publicly traded company, you think that in having a bearing on their operations that they would know who those people were making those decisions. So there's not a clear path, and this next slide I'm going to show you is a historical look at transmission investment. And again, if you look at the activity that states have had both on renewable portfolio standards and trying to get clean energy or renewable energy jobs within their states, this investment path is not reflected for the amount of activity we've had on the state legislative level. You can see that it's trended back up, and this down dip here, there was a time when a lot of states were considering deregulation of their utilities, and so a lot of utilities didn't know if they were going to be in the transmission business any longer, so that's where you saw that huge drop happen. But if you look at the amount of activity since 1975 and where we're at as far as the build-out goes of smart and renewable technologies, that this is not anywhere representative of where we should be as far as investment in transmission goes. There's this thing, and without getting into the weeds, on integrated resource planning, because integrated resource planning is a very important tool that I'm a big promoter of and have been an advocate of. And here in Washington State, we actually require all of our 63 utilities, 3 privately owned, publicly traded, the other 60 municipal utilities of some type, to all do what we call least reasonable cost integrated resource planning. And there's another process just called least cost integrated resource planning. The difference being on least cost, you just take into account fuel costs, so how much does coal cost, how much does natural gas cost, and least reasonable cost, you take into account the lifetime risk of that generation asset over the life of that facility. And also you have to compare a gas plant, a coal plant, or a wind farm against energy efficiency investments on a cost per megawatt basis. and then they come up with a preferred portfolio of what is the least risk and least expensive of assets to buy. But the reality is that those, while a good process, this IRP process, are not consistent. One of the things we've seen here in the Northwest, again, to take from my own personal experience, is that almost all the projects being slated for purchase in by Washington State utilities out to the 2015 to 2025 period are going to be in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and other Northwest Western states. They're not going to be built in Washington State. So when we talk about this disjointed IRP planning process from the reality of where these resources are going to be in other jurisdictions, there's no coordination happening at all. The other thing that's happened is because there has been no, because of the lack of transmission development, most actually needed generation resources, being combined cycled gas plants and even some single-fired generation gas or single turbine gas plants, tend to be the most immediate, most expedient thing to build near load centers, because near gas pipelines, because it's the quickest thing you can get in the ground to meet increased economic growth. And so the case here, particularly in the West, is that most of the new plants have been near both transmission and natural gas pipelines. And this came from a 2008 study that I was actually headed up with the Idaho National Lab that was called The Cost of Not Building Transmission. If anybody's interested in looking at the economic loss, that if you don't build needed transmission, what the economic loss is to your state, this is a great, one of the first models that took a look at, what that economic loss was if you didn't have resources to meet the potential economic growth that you have within your jurisdiction. I'm just going to show these slides to be demonstrative of really what we're talking about. These are current generation assets in the United States. And again, I'm not going to go through and tell you what each of the dots are, but this is basically where the generation is coming from today. This is, I'm sorry for the varying maps, but this is the Western governors put out what they call the RES, which was looking at renewable energy resources in the West and where they're actually located at. And what's important is to look at, and you need to kind of focus on the colors here. So, the purple or lavender might be a wind resource. This is both solar and geothermal. There's a lot of run-of-river hydro and development up in British Columbia, which is what that represents. You can look where that's located at, and then versus where our current generation's assets at. Current generation assets are going to be where transmission is at today, and where transmission actually needs to go, which is represented in where these resources are at. This is from that cost of not building transmission study I referenced that was done in 2008, which is getting to be a little bit dated, but it's still relevant. And I want to put this up for a couple of reasons. One is that these were all proposed transmission projects back in 2008, and what we did by economic loss is we ranked 50 or so projects into the top 10, so legislators actually knew which ones would have the biggest economic loss to the region if they were not built, and we triaged a list that way. Out of these, the only one that's actually in some sort of construction phase is this Shelby to Livingston line here between Alberta and Montana, which is a very small line. I think it's 115 kilovolts, and it's been very controversial. Matter of fact, it was just bought by Enbridge from the project developer. All these are proposed lines. I want to show this for a couple reasons. You remember that resource map? Tremendous resources up here and over in here and for renewables. A lot of geothermal here in Idaho. All these dots represent actually new projects of different resources, and they'll always follow the path of transmission. This is not the only windy spot in Idaho, I can guarantee you that. But yet all these new wind projects are being built along that transmission line because access to transmission is so important to make these projects realistic. Just as an aside, this is the offshore Southeast Alaska DC light is what they call it. It's a direct current line that's supposed to be a marine cable down the coast and eventually down to California. Again, to kind of start going to a close here on what the problem is and some solutions, this is a generic timeline map for planning a transmission project. They're hoping it's going to be 7 years. I like to contrast this kind of project management Gantt type chart with an actual project here. This is a 2007 project started by Idaho Power. It's called the Border to Hemingway project. And this is the history of that project. These are the different steps they've gone through actually to get that project moving forward. 2007 they announced the project. 2008 they're moving along. Here's a little bit more history of it in 2009. Here's 2010 is showing up where they're at in this process. Again, we're getting the winter of 2011 down here, the spring of 2011, in kind of real time where they're at right now. This is actually a small project. And again, it's one thing to look at something on a timeline chart, but the reality of what utilities are going through and merchants are going through to build transmission lines are represented in all these different steps they're taking with state and the federal government. The solution I believe, is regional compacts between the states and the provinces in North America. You know, if we want to have regional needs realized, we have to have regional coordination and siting. If we leave it to the federal government to come in and run a national siting process, we will never get regional needs realized in that process. And I'll give you an example going back to this slide here. They've got 5,000 megawatts of potential electricity coming from the oil sands up in Alberta. And this path represents the path of least resistance to build a transmission line to California where load's at. If you wanted to open up resources, wind resources, geothermal resources, potential for Montana, Idaho, you would link up the weakest part of the western grid, which is the eastern part of Montana, Alberta, and down into Utah in this area, and come into the Turlock area probably. That will never happen because they can't get it permitted with the way that we run permitting today in the United States and in North America. The other thing about is that we also can strengthen the grid through regional processes, like I just mentioned. Probably the most important thing that a compact has to realize is that, and we do this in Washington State with our current intra-state siting law, is that a legislature must declare that there's a need for energy infrastructure. Most of these projects get bogged down in the trying to actually say you need this project and the legal fight around that. The reality is that with all those competing planning plans, you can tie up the need argument for years in the courts. You must be technology neutral. You can have policies that say you've got performance standards in Washington State, you have to be at 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour of CO2 emissions for any generation, but that's technology neutral. So if you come up with carbon capture or sequestration technology for coal, that qualifies underneath that type of standard. But you shouldn't come in and say we're not going to have coal. I think you've got to be technology neutral in a compact, and it must be open to Mexico and Canada. I think if we're going to compete in a worldwide marketplace, we've got to bring North American assets to bear to have the cheapest, most reliable power possible. On a Microsoft moment here, this is for all of you that have smartphones. If you go to your App Center and download the Microsoft Tag program with your smartphone, you can take a picture of this, and that's my symbol. And it will immediately download all your information into your phone if you want to contact me. So with that, that wraps up my remarks. I appreciate your attention to them.